Hi, and welcome to Roy Morgan's first micro webinar. These short sessions look at the quarterly changes in Australia's rankings of the most trusted and most distrusted brands. But let me kick off by introducing social scientist Dr. Ross Honeywell. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Michelle.
So trust is the foundation of all human connections. It's the cornerstone of a sustainable future. And the linkage between trust and reputation goes well beyond marketing and comms. For example, Unilever's CEO reports that trust and reputation accounted for 75% of the global giant's market cap. Okay, so that's the shiny side of the trust coin. But it's distrust where our pain and sense of betrayal really comes to the surface. Now, distrust isn't just the absence of trust. It's something much more sinister. An absence of trust isn't great for a brand, obviously, but it's not necessarily a disaster. On the other hand, what is a disaster is distrust. Just look at Facebook or AMP or Rio Tinto. AMP lost 80% of its market value when its reputation was trashed by the Banking Royal Commission. And Rio Tinto lost its chairman and CEO after it destroyed the Duke and Gorge Indigenous Heritage Site in Western Australia. Okay, so let's take a wider look at which industries are doing well and which are doing really badly in these trust and distrust stakes. First of all, where does this information all come from? What makes us have the right to say these things? Well, since 2018, we at Roy Morgan have been asking well over 1,000 Australians every month which brands they trust and which they distrust. Crucially, we ask why they trust or distrust the brands that they nominate. And it's totally open-ended and it's totally unprompted, no context. And being unprompted without a context means that for Australians who nominate a brand as one that they trust or distrust, that brand must be so top of mind that they put it ahead of all of the multiple brands swirling around in their consciousness. So it must be really important to them. What we then do at Roy Morgan is roll up or bring together all of those brands into industry sectors. So what did we find? If we look at this chart here, look at those in the green, they have more trust than distrust, and those in red have more distrust than trust. So supermarkets remain the big winners in the most recent quarter. No surprises really. General retail is second, followed by consumer products.
The supermarkets really did step up during COVID, there's no doubt about it. And social media, look at that, it's become even more distrusted than banks. And that's totally new in this quarter. What about the individual brands though, Michelle?
Yeah, let's look at some of those individual brands. So in the June quarter, if we look at the chart here, we see Woolworths and Coles continue their tussle for the top position as Australia's most trusted brand. And they are so close. Outside the top four, the rise of retail continues. Kmart, Myer, Big W, IGA, Target and JB Hi-Fi all improved their rankings on the most trusted list. We obviously love our shopping.
We do. Look at Apple. It dropped from 7th to 16th. And how about the ABC, Michelle? It's dropped from 10th to 19th and risks being totally outside the top 20.
Yep.
What's totally remarkable about that is that 2 years ago, the ABC, you remember it ranked number 5.
Absolutely.
That's really an extraordinary collapse for it to go from 5th to 19th in just 2 years.
Yeah, look, let's have a look at that. But let's take a closer look, first of all, at a couple of the really big movers in the trust rankings. So we'll look at the ABC in a minute, but remember Apple fell from 7th to 16th. And just before we talk specifically about that, a quick reminder on how these charts work. The green columns reflect trust scores, the red columns show distrust scores, and that black trend line is the net score. And we calculate that net score by subtracting distrust from trust scores. And you can see from that black line for Apple, this is the Apple chart, that it's always had a net trust score. It's always in green territory.
Yeah, and once COVID hit, what happens is we really relied on technology during COVID more than ever before, and
Absolutely.
a lot of the technology brands did really well out of that. And Apple, like most of the others, suffered a strange mix of increasing trust, but also increasing distrust. That's really, really odd. Fortunately for Apple, its trust spiked soon after COVID, and it increased more than its distrust. Now, we'll take a look at the Google shortly, because the opposite was true for Google.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ross. I remember when this all first happened and we saw these tech companies coming in with greater trust and a bit more distrust, and we said, what's that all about? But we all very quickly became reliant on all sorts of tech that we probably hadn't bothered with previously. And I guess the really important thing is what happened then. And looking at this chart, we see Apple suffered a really big decline this quarter. So let's look at what Australians said about why. I guess the first thing, when you ask people why they trust Apple, the first thing you know is that people who love Apple really love Apple. And they'll put up with almost anything to stay in the Apple ecosystem. They want Apple to be successful, and that's a great thing for a brand, whether it's design, creativity, or the deep integration into people's lives. These are all reasons why people and consumers love Apple.
One thing I've learned over the years is that Apple users know, particularly recently, that the company's really fanatical about protecting their privacy.
Yeah.
And you're right about Apple lovers being baked on. I'm an Apple lover, and all my devices are Apple. And it's inconceivable to me that I'd ever make a move to another ecosystem, particularly to something like your BlackBerry.
I'm totally rusted onto my BlackBerry, Ross.
You are. But Apple really, if we think about what it's doing quarter by quarter, it needs to stay ahead of the innovation curve, and it really needs to bring out bigger improvements with each release.
Yeah, I thought these distrust comments were really interesting, Ross. You know, Apple kind of flew in from nowhere with innovative ideas and things that we never dreamt that we'd want. And now some people are saying once you start using them, it's difficult to change, or the idea that they deliberately slow down their products is very challenging. Anyway, that's what people were saying about Apple. So that's Apple. Now let's take a quick look at the ABC. The ABC really should be one of our most trusted brands. There is no question it should be. We all rely on it. When there are floods, when there are bushfires, when there's an election, all kinds of events where we need almost real-time information, we rely on the ABC. So in June 2019, when the ABC was the 5th most trusted brand in all of Australia, that felt right. That felt like about where the ABC should be. But over the past year, the ABC's trust has been steadily eroded, steadily declining.
Yeah, it's interesting that its distrust has barely changed. It's really the trust that's tanking. But look at that dotted line, Michelle. That's the ABC. That's their monthly net scores, and that really spiked when COVID hit. And it just shows how Australians turn to the ABC in a crisis.
Yeah, that decline is extraordinary. The increase for COVID is exactly what you'd expect. You'd expect that massive going to the ABC in a crisis, but what happens next is what really matters. And what we saw is once that initial crisis was past, and I'm not saying COVID's past, but the initial panic and not knowing what's going on, all of the frustrations, the left-leaning political bias accusations resurfaced about the ABC, really as we learn to live with the changing circumstances that COVID brought us. Just look here at Australians' reasons for distrusting the ABC. They're not impartial, they lean too far to the left, it seems they're the propaganda arm of the Labor Party, there's a lack of balance.
Sorry to interrupt, but
No, that's fine.
what I think is incredible is that they're losing their trust, not in the conservative ranks where you'd expect those attitudes, you'd really expect them to think that, but they're losing it in their heartland, the ALP voter heartland.
Yeah, that is really extraordinary. I mean, there's always been a group of very strong right-wing conservative people who felt the ABC was biased. Probably always will. But this is becoming the view of the vast majority, more people and people in their heartland. So let's stay with this bad news theme and take a look at the distrust rankings of all brands. We often think about trust as pretty much business as usual. Ross, you and I have looked at all the reasons why people trust brands. They look very much like the reasons that they're satisfied with brands. They're often to do with service or how you feel about the brand positively. They're a bit like NPS. Yeah, I'd recommend it to a friend.
Just like it.
So the things to do with trust move up and down, but it doesn't seem to generate material damage to a brand. Losing a little bit of trust doesn't really create material damage to a brand. Distrust, on the other hand, has very negative stages that are nothing to do with trust. Not only the absence of trust, it's nothing to do with that. They're these very negative stages, and we've seen distrust can destroy a brand very quickly. So which are our most distrusted brands? Well, Facebook and Telstra remain the pigeon pair as the most distrusted brands in Australia, with Amazon and News Corp changing back and forth between third and fourth. Crown, Fox and 3 of the big banks have all lost ground and are more distrusted now than they were in the last quarter.
Harvey Norman seems to be the big loser in this quarter, Michelle. Look at that.
Yeah, it went from a ranking of about 35 to become the 18th most distrusted brand in Australia. And remember, these are distrust rankings. So the higher the ranking, the worse the distrust. It's the opposite for trust rankings, where the higher the ranking, the better.
Yeah, let's take a closer look at Harvey Norman. But Michelle, going back to Google, while its rankings only jumped 2 places, its net distrust score decline in its net distrust score this quarter was one of the largest of all of them.
Yeah, it was. And it's interesting because really I think data breaches by Facebook alerted the users of search and social media to the dangers and pitfalls of the giant platforms knowing too much about us. It wasn't necessarily Google, but all of these things brought these fears to mind. And truly, how many times have you actually Googled accommodation in a destination city only to find that Google serves you an airline ad or hotel ads or rental car ads in that city? And the great fear, so they know, and the great fear is that they're selling your personal information to other companies.
Yeah, I think plenty of people have said they said something to their loved one that they'd like to go to Los Angeles, and all of a sudden they're getting stuff in Los Angeles. Everyone blames them for that. Anyway, that's really why Google is consistently more distrusted than trusted. Are they listening in on our deepest thoughts and desires?
And then selling them. So when we look at this chart, this is the Google chart showing it over time. There really is a lot of volatility month on month for Google, but it's pretty consistently in the red. And it's now at an all-time low in this last quarter.
And there's that growth that I talked about earlier in both trust and distrust of the tech brands that they experience from COVID's onset. But in this case, Google's distrust has really outstripped, fortunately, its trust scores.
And it really does all come down to our fears about what Google might be doing with our personal data. So when we ask people why they trust and distrust Google, we actually see that people value Google. It gives me all the information I need. I mean, we can't imagine a world without Google. But 2/3 of people who distrust Google say Google doesn't respect or protect their privacy.
Yeah, look, this is a classic case of the business rule that you and I talk about frequently, and that's that you can't restore trust without first reducing the distrust. And, we were talking about Harvey Norman earlier, and that's very much the case for Harvey Norman. It's the biggest loser in the distrust rankings.
Yeah. So Harvey Norman, it really is literally a household name in Australia. Just about everyone has at some time shopped at Harvey Norman. What we need to understand is why Harvey Norman's net trust position has deteriorated so dramatically. And the first piece of evidence is from this chart, which basically shows us that within 6 or 8 weeks of COVID restrictions coming into play, Harvey Norman's trust had started to decline and its distrust had increased. So what we know for sure is that since COVID, Australians have changed their view of Harvey Norman from a trusted brand to a distrusted brand. So let's explore why. And, you know, if we aggregate all of the reasons that people give us for distrust, about 80% of people who distrust Harvey Norman say that it's greedy, unethical, corrupt, or too motivated by commercial interests.
And there's no doubt that particularly during this June quarter, that's driven by the company's decision to keep around 22 million in JobKeeper payments, despite their profits doubling to, I think it was 462 million during the COVID crisis. And when we analyse the individual verbatims, you know, what people really said, what's interesting is that many of them blame Gerry Harvey personally.
And Ross, this is unusual. We don't normally see that kind of thing, the names of the owners coming through in distrust comments. It really is very unusual.
Yeah.
I guess that's the downside of your founder or CEO taking a really public position. So, for instance, if you look at AMP, when AMP destroyed its reputation during the Royal Commission, no one really knew who was in charge. Most Australians kind of had no idea who to blame for making them feel foolish, for trusting too much. It was just an institution.
Yeah, it's true. And these perceptions aren't always connected to reality, though, are they? After all, they've since repaid 6 million of those JobKeeper payments. And I know for a fact that Gerry Harvey has saved Australian businesses from bankruptcy. You know, I think overall he's a really great Australian business icon.
Sure, and I might think the same, but this is not about what you and I think, Ross. This is what Australians think. And, you know, perceptions of Australians are reality. And, you know, they've spoken. And I think probably this is the price that a company pays for its leader being too public. And that price is that he or she has to really personally wear the unpopular decisions or bad news. I guess the good news for Harvey Norman is that its trust score is higher than that of AMP and its distrust is lower than AMP's. But clearly it still has a lot of work to do on its damaged reputation.
Yep.
So that brings us to a close on this, our first micro webinar. Thank you, Ross, for another lively discussion.
You're more than welcome. Thanks, Michelle. One final thing, though, before you finish. We've had a couple of questions during this of how to get more data.
Well, that's easy. Ask Roy Morgan. But the latest risk reports are always available on the Roy Morgan online store. So let's hook up again in December and have a detailed look at what's happened since then. We'll have a look at the September quarter in trust and distrust. In the meantime, if anyone would like to ask a question or would like to get a copy of this presentation, email us at askroymorgan@roymorgan.com. Until next time, stay safe.